The bells tolled low and mournful in the thick, wintry air of an ancient Italian convent. The hour was late, and Charles Dickens, the master chronicler of humanity's joy and suffering, stirred uneasily in his narrow bed. A single candle burned low, casting its trembling light on the cold stone walls. Dickens awoke abruptly, his chest tight, his breath shallow, as though the air in the room had turned to ice. At first, he thought it was a nightmare, the product of a restless mind. But then he saw it. A figure stood at the foot of his bed, silent and still, its form shrouded in blue, a color that seemed almost alive, shimmering faintly as though caught between this world and the next. Its face was indistinct, cloaked in shadow, but its presence was undeniable. A crushing sorrow filled the room, pressing down on Dickens' heart. What are you? He whispered, his voice trembling with fear. The figure made no reply, yet he felt its sorrow reach into him, wrapping itself around his very soul. The figure hesitated, its silence stretching unbearably. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it began to dissolve, its form melting into the flickering shadows until only the faint chill of its presence remained. When morning came, Dickens dismissed the vision as a dream, a figment of his imagination brought on by the eerie surroundings of the convent. Yet, deep in his heart, he knew better. He had seen something real, something beyond reason, and it had left him shaken. The scene Dickens recounts is so strangely similar to that in the bedchamber of Ebenezer Scrooge, pleading with the ghost of Christmas yet to come to speak to him, that one might almost wonder if Dickens had some sort of unconscious premonition of the later event, incorporating the profound episode into the book published the year before it even happened. And that seems just the kind of possibility that Dickens, inquisitive Victorian child that he was, would have loved to consider. As always, though, the skeptic was right there with an explanation for it all. Dismissing the fact that, in the moment, he'd been totally convinced of the visitor's reality, he told his friend that it must have been the influence of his surroundings, the convent, the church bells, much like Scrooge's later undigested bit of beef, a blot of mustard, that had led his mind to conjure up this Madonna-like figure, Dickens' own private Marian apparition, it seemed. This was far from the only time Dickens blamed the mind, or perhaps minds, for extraordinary things. In fact, it was another Christmas story of his that made him question just what had happened when an unsung artist accused him of plagiarism. In 1861, Dickens wrote a collection of ghost stories for publication in his magazine All the Year Round. In one of the tales, a young woman inquires whether a local artist could remember her face sufficiently to paint her portrait months after their meeting, without sitting for him. She soon passes away, and the puzzled painter later realizes that at their meeting, the potential client was already dead. Thomas Heapy was enraged when he read Dickens' story. Not only had Heapy written a closely identical story to be published the next Christmas in another magazine, but Heapy also said the story was true, that he himself was the artist in the tale. The paranormally minded Dickens, far from arguing with the young man, was filled with wonder. Adding to the already bizarre coincidences involved, he marveled at the date he himself had marked in the margin of his story after writing it, September 13th. It was the same date he had been visited by the Phantom Girl. Friend and biographer John Forster would later write about Dickens' quote, hankering after ghosts, end quote, and that certainly seems an apt description. His thoughts and his interests, like his stories, were filled with strange cracks and tickings, the rustling of garments that have no substance in them, and the tread of dreadful feet that would leave no mark on the sea sand or the winter snow. But for Dickens, ghost was a notion as complex as one of his keenly detailed narratives, and equally as personal. Dickens' interest in the supernatural began, like it does for so many of us, with childhood ghost stories. I've often credited much of my own interest in the paranormal with being scared half out of my mind by the books I was reading, the ghost in our own house, and a crippling fear of death, not necessarily in that order. For Dickens, it all began with the stories told to him by Mary Weller, his nurse, who he called Mercy, who would accompany her thrilling tales with all sorts of terrorizing hand gestures, spooky articulations, and facial contortions, by all accounts totally inappropriate for a child of Dickens's age. She likely had little regard for the scandal she caused. She was only 13 herself, and a gifted storyteller who brought to the Dickens household a whole repertoire of folk tales she had learned as a country child. Dickens also devoured the weekly horror publication, The Terrific Register, a penny dreadful full of ghoulish yarns and illustrations to curl one's hair. The stories in it, quote, frightened my very wits out of my head, he said, and made him miserable. But the fear was, for Dickens, delicious. Later, he would absolutely love producing that same kind of fear in his own audiences. Once, after a public reading of one of his ghostly tales, he bragged to his wife with great satisfaction that an attendee had been reduced to sobs of terror and had to recline and compose herself. Dickens also knew what people wanted. He was keenly aware of the Victorian fascination with all things macabre and occult, especially brushes with the living dead. He knew that scares equaled sales, and it was just a happy chance for him that he liked delivering the former as much as collecting the latter. On Halloween night, 1859, Dickens dashed off a letter to a friend and fellow writer named William Howitt. Dickens had a question for his colleague. Could Howitt steer him to a house in London, or indeed within the United Kingdom for that matter, quote, where nobody can live, eat, drink, stand, lie, or sleep without molestation by a ghost, end quote. If so, Dickens and his good friend John Hollingshead would be most interested in moving in for a night or two. In response to Dickens' letter, Howitt suggests an inn in the small village of Holborn, after which Dickens sent Hollingshead off to the remote hamlet to check it out. Sadly, his friend found it to be a tumble-down pothouse with nary a ghost in sight. Later, Dickens and Hollingshead, joined by fellow writer Wilkie Collins, made a long trek to Hertfordshire to spend the night at another promising property. When they arrived, they couldn't even find the place and retired to the local pub. Howitt was a spiritualist, one of the shocking number of people of the time who had come to believe in and become obsessed with communication with spirits. Though Dickens was intrigued by the paranormal and even experimented with the fad of mesmerism, a sort of mental healing aided at times by ghosts. His interest was more of the skeptics, and his letter to Howitt seemed more of a challenge to his friend's spiritualist claim than an excited desire to hunt ghosts. More Houdini than Harry Price, if you will. Howitt and Dickens had gotten into a bit of an argument over a series of editorials Dickens had written about spiritualism and about the alleged messages from the dead that drove its popularity. While Howitt was a fervent sitter with a strong belief in the movement, Dickens had another theory about it all. He believed that the messages from the dead were actually coming from the dying, not the already deceased, a theory certainly inspired by his dabbling in mesmerism, in which he'd seen just how powerful the mind could be. It was also an idea that would be later chronicled through account after account in the book Phantasms of the Living, a classic of parapsychology. First published in 1886, 16 years after Dickens' death, this comprehensive 2-volume work was a collaboration between Edmund Gurney, Frederick W. H. Myers, and Frank Podmore, notable members of the Society for Psychical Research. The authors, aiming to revolutionize perceptions of ghosts, present a theory that explains ghost-seeing phenomena through the concept of telepathy, with over 700 case studies meticulously documented. Volume 1 features an introduction by Myers and an explanation of the analytical methods employed in the study. It delves into various topics including hypnotism, the telepathic transmission of ideas, mental imagery, emotional impressions, dreams, hallucinations, and even presents a captivating essay on the historical significance of witchcraft. Probably the first ghost story I ever heard, outside of my own experiences in our haunted house, was from my mother, and it was a story Dickens would have welcomed to illustrate his own beliefs regarding communication with the dead. The incident played out in my maternal grandparents' bedroom on Cuyler Avenue on Chicago's North Side, just before the end of World War II. One of their 7 children, William, had been drafted just before the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Uncle Will was a poet and a pacifist, but he went willingly and was gone for 4 years. Then, on the night of June 17th, 1944, my grandmother awoke suddenly and sat straight up in bed. At its foot stood William, dressed in uniform, smiling at her. She cried out to her husband beside her, "Joseph, William's home." His eyes flew open and he too saw his son there, but only for an instant. Then William was gone. The next day, as you can probably guess, a telegram arrived from the War Department. William had been killed just hours earlier in an airfield explosion on Saipan Island. At the moment of his death, it seemed, Will had come home to say goodbye. This is just the sort of phantasm of the living, or dying, in my uncle's case, that Dickens believed to be behind the communications from the, quote, dead, so rampant in his day and in ours. He certainly would not believe that the millions of alleged encounters today between hobby ghost hunters and their phantasmagorical prey are anything but tricks of the mind. The powerful, powerful mind he'd witnessed firsthand in mesmerism and in what he saw as the totally unsubstantiated psychological fervor over spiritualism. I'm not sure what Dickens' theory would be about reports that his own spirit now haunts Boston's Parker House Hotel, where he stayed during a promotional tour of A Christmas Carol. The hotel's history carries on memories of that time, when staff reported hearing the writer practicing the various character voices of the story, preparing for public readings of it. The mirror in the room where he stayed is supposedly haunted. They say that guests sometimes see reflected in it the ghost of the long-dead Dickens, practicing his dramatic skills even now. Humbug, I can hear him comment. But that Dickens' ghost haunts America, albeit in a very different way, is a fact, and it's one that dates from an earlier American tour in 1842. That year, Dickens arrived on American soil with his wife, Catherine, their kids, and the author's pet raven, a talkative thing named Grip. Dickens was just 30 years old, but his arrival caused what some call the modern world's first real celebrity frenzy. The mutual love affair between Dickens and the Americans would quickly sour for both sides, but that's a story for another day. A couple of years earlier, the soon-to-be great American Gothic writer Edgar Allan Poe had reviewed the first chapters of Dickens' novel, Barnaby Rudge, and he'd loved it. He'd taken a particular liking to the Barnaby character's pet raven, and when Dickens and Poe met on that first American tour, Poe was utterly delighted to discover that the bird was real. And most historians now agree that Grip was the inspiration for Poe's most famous work, The Raven. Dickens loved that bird too. When it passed away, he took it to a taxidermist so he could keep it around forever. The stuffed Grip is, today, part of the collections of Philadelphia's Free Library. A number of scholars have gone out of their way to insist that Dickens did not himself believe in ghosts, though he was obviously enchanted by the question of their existence. In 3 of his books, Nicholas Nickleby, Dombey and Sons, and A Tale of Two Cities, he and his characters refer to one of the most scandalous poltergeist cases on record, that of London's Cock Lane ghost, with typical Dickensian amusement. Interestingly, the Cock Lane events broke out at Christmas time in 1762, predating Dickens' own Yuletide classic by many decades. The hallmark of the Cock Lane case was an outbreak of knockings that led to communication sessions between the living and the alleged dead. The whole thing turned out to be one great hoax, and between the outbreak and its conclusion, a truly terrific scandal played out in the daily papers, a scandal populated by a cast of characters worthy of Dickens' own pen. Despite that, or maybe because of it, the episode made a great impact on the young Londoner. Indeed, like the Cock Lane ghost, most of Dickens' ghost stories are not supernatural spectaculars, but morality plays. Lots of joviality contrasts with the spooky, or sometimes really scary moments, and everything comes out all right in the end. Dickens' skepticism was present in his editorial pieces, his private letters, and his dealings with the famed Ghost Club, the Society of Paranormal Skeptics of which he was reportedly a founding member. But Dickens had his own brushes with death, and maybe even with the dead, even though he may not have admitted that's what they were. Mary Hogarth was the sister of Dickens' wife, Catherine, and when the latter married the up-and-coming author, Mary and Charles became much more than siblings. They became the closest of friends. Mary and Catherine joined Dickens one evening to watch a performance of one of his plays in the West End. Though she was in good spirits and fit as a fiddle during the outing, a sudden illness came over Mary upon the trio's return home. She died the next day in Charles's arms. Mary's death devastated the busy writer, who immediately, heartbreakingly, wrote his own alternative ending to the story by creating the character of Rose Maylie and including her in Oliver Twist, the book he was writing when Mary died. He describes Rose as mild and gentle, pure and powerful, and no one doubted who the inspiration had been. You could definitely say that Dickens was haunted by the young woman after her death. The two of them had exchanged lockets containing pieces of each other's hair, and Dickens later took a ring off the dead girl's finger to wear. as the weeks and months turned to years, he dreamt of her, and he even expressed a desire to be buried someday by her side. Over the years, many have wondered if there was something untoward in the relationship between Dickens and his sister-in-law, though Mary's own letters tell no such tale. She gushed over him, yes, but it was mainly to praise his happy influence on her sister. The devastation of Mary's departure notwithstanding, it's no secret that the thing which most haunted Dickens, far more viciously and relentlessly than even Hogwarts' loss, was his father's disappearance into debtor's prison, forcing the 12-year-old Charles to work in a bootblacking factory to help support the family. It was misery. 10-hour days, 6 days a week for just a few shillings. The experience of his father's arrest and absence, coupled with the grim labor, would color everything he would write. It shouldn't be surprising that Dickens had an experience of seeing his father's ghost one morning, in that hour just before dawn that the writer spoke of as the most ghostly time. It was, like all of Dickens' paranormal experiences, an event that deeply moved and troubled him, but again failed to convince him that the vision's source was anything more than his own mind. In that dim light, Dickens saw his father as if he were, quote, alive and well, sitting with his back towards me on a seat that stood beside my bed. His head was resting on his hand, and whether he was slumbering or grieving, I could not discern. Amazed to see him there, I sat up, moved my position, leaned out of bed, and I watched him. As he did not move then, I became alarmed and laid my hand upon his shoulder. But his hand touched only air. Today, the UK is all in with the ghost stories at Christmas phenomenon that Dickens was largely responsible for popularizing in modern times. Here in the United States, the tradition never really caught on. Dickens' friend, Washington Irving, shared Dickens' love of the supernatural and even published some Christmas ghost stories himself, but they never eclipsed his other works like A Christmas Carol did for Dickens. Scholars theorize that while America and England shared some of the same puritanical beliefs that burned witches, the American experience also includes a secularism and future thinking that has sought to leave all of that behind, at least for some. A few years back now, I traveled to England to film a documentary on the late great English ghost story writer M.R. James, whose tales, though always popular, resurface increasingly each year as the snow flies and carols come on the radio. James is often cited as one of the most obvious literary children of Dickens, but it wasn't A Christmas Carol that most influenced the stories of James. Rather, it was Dickens' last, dark ghost stories that made an irrevocable impression on the young academic. In particular, it was Dickens' macabre masterpiece, The Signalman, that most captured James's Gothic imagination. The story is believed to have been inspired by two real accidents that occurred in the years before the publication of the Dickens short story. In 1861, a crash accident in the Clayton Tunnel near Brighton, England, led to the deaths of 23 passengers, most of whom were scalded to death in the last car. More than 170 were also injured. The horrific event, which played out in the chilling darkness of the tunnel, deeply affected Britons, maybe more so the empathic Dickens. Then, in the summer of 1865, at the age of 53, Dickens found himself on board the boat train from Folkestone, in the south of England, to London, accompanied by his paramour, actress Ellen Ternan, and her mother. The train derailed at Staplehurst while crossing a viaduct where a piece of track had been removed during construction. Dickens and his companions survived, but 10 fellow passengers did not. He himself rushed to help a number of the victims. Some died by his side. This experience had a profound impact, leaving Dickens unable to speak for 2 weeks. Subsequently, he developed a deep apprehension towards train travel, resorting to alternative means whenever possible. 5 years to the day after the Staplehurst derailment, Dickens passed away. His son later revealed that his father had never fully recovered from the traumatizing event. Moments after his death, a drawing was done of the now silent story master. In it, Dickens is pictured with his jaw tied up with a cloth. It was a common practice of the time to keep the mouth from falling open ignobly. But for us, not accustomed to the antique gesture, the detail evokes only one thing: the ghost of Jacob Marley. Dickens had died at his home near Rochester in Kent. He had left instructions for a private funeral and for burial in the churchyard at Rochester Cathedral. His wishes were famously ignored, and plans for interment in Westminster Abbey commenced. Each Christmas Eve, they say, the ghost of Charles Dickens can be seen wandering the grounds of Rochester Castle, where he often rambled in life. He is seen as a young man at the height of his popularity. Others swear they've seen him standing before Restoration House, gazing silently at this, the Gothic residence that inspired Satie's house in Great Expectations. At midnight, they say, as the clock in the Corn Exchange tolls the start of Christmas Day, Dickens is there, perhaps wistfully remembering Scrooge's midnight visitors that traveled from his own mind into the imaginations of so many to come. Or are these stories, too, just a humbug? They say there are no atheists in foxholes. Maybe there are no ghost disbelievers in midnight bedchambers. I don't know. What I do know is that Charles Dickens may indeed not have believed in ghosts, but in a world in love with the supernatural, he was and is one of the most haunted of them all.